Well, welcome everybody. Welcome to our guest. This is the third in our series of What Writing Does. As part of this series, we've been trying to move beyond this notion of writing as a universal definition of what makes writing good. And usually that comes down to writing that's relatively error-free, but we know that writing does a lot more work than that. So we have our guest here today to talk about what writing does in very particular contexts. I think that's where writing gets really interesting. You know, what kinds of questions do people ask? What counts as evidence? What types of arguments? And to what purpose do people write in particular fields? So our three speakers this week are from empirical fields, both from psychology and biology. We've got Dr. Eric Murphy from the Department of Psychology, who's a homegrown person here, right? I've known Eric for a long time.
I was in Dr. Kayson's class in 1996 or 7.
Yeah.
A long time ago.
Yeah. We both apologized to each other. I was very new in my career.
And I gave her a hard time.
I think we cordial. But that's what makes them good. And then we've also got Dr. Don Spallinger and Dr. Chris Duddleston from the biology department. They are going to be presenting together. So I want to welcome our speakers and thank you for being here today. These have been exciting series, and I'm happy to hear what you have to say. And then we'll have a time for questions, so keep track of any questions that come to mind.
Okay, so I put together just a brief presentation around the outline that Dr. Kayson sent me. And so I don't have a lot of detail, but I will talk a lot, I think. And if you have questions, feel free to ask them when they come to you, okay? And I think probably my presentation will have a lot of overlap with the biological sciences as well, because I don't work with humans, I work with rats, and actually a lot of what I do is considered natural science, not social science. But I do teach in the psychology department. I do publish and I do write a lot myself. Apparently, I just had a book come out with John Wiley and Sons, a textbook for advanced undergraduates and graduate students. And the two main courses I teach is Learning and Cognition, which is the one I'm going to talk about. It's kind of my case study and how I teach writing and the things that I emphasize as a professor. And then the other one I teach is Behavioral Neuroscience, and even though that one's more content-driven, I do have a paper requirement in that course because it is an integrated general education requirement with the biological sciences. So this is as close as I get to working with people, or animals, I should say, with behavioral disorders. If you have problems, don't come and tell me. I'm not that type of psychologist. But I think what I have to say does apply to all of psychology, and like I mentioned, with the natural sciences as well. So just some general genres of writing, and I'm speaking as an academic here, the kinds of writing that I do and my colleagues do in the Department of Psychology. Obviously empirical journal articles, you know, the reporting of experimental findings and so forth, getting it out there. You know, one of the things that's hard to tell students about, especially at the undergraduate level, is that, you know, collecting the data and answering the question is the fun part, but really the most important part is disseminating that information. So empirical articles, literature / theoretical reviews. So summarizing a piece of the literature, maybe adding a new theoretical viewpoint to it. And then finally, grant writing. Doesn't get a lot of press, but selling one's ideas so you can get funding to do the research that you want to do. So those are the three major genres that I can think of. Of course, the other genres that you see occasionally, like in Psychology Today or Scientific American, is more writing to the public. I don't have much experience with that, so I'm not going to talk about it. All right, so my own experience with writing, it's kind of interesting because I'm fundamentally a behaviorist. I look at psychology through the lens of that viewpoint in psychology, so everything has a behavioral component to it. So I look at writing as a behavior, and it's something that should be amenable to studying empirically. And so one thing that comes out of the science of psychology is a lot of deliberate practice is what's required to be an expert in any domain, writing included. If you want to become an expert skier, you have to do a lot of deliberate practice. To be a good writer, you have to do a lot of deliberate practice. And I found writing to be an incredibly difficult behavior on my own part. And luckily, I was able to apply the principles of behavior analysis to study my own behavior and increase my productivity. And I'm not going to go into all the details of what I've done to myself in order to increase productivity. But if you want me to elaborate on that, I can. I was really lucky as an undergraduate. My main mentor here was Dr. Bob Madigan. He's been retired for about 10 years. But I was really lucky in that he studied discourse processes, so language, writing, and so forth. And so my writing got really scrutinized by an expert. So I had a lot of good immediate feedback from him. When I was in graduate school, my primary advisor was actually an associate editor of a major journal. So trust me, I ended up burning all of my copies of my dissertation, but I probably had about 20 different versions in various stages with a lot of red ink on it. So feedback is really important. And then exemplars from published articles. One of the things I did early in my career, especially as an advanced undergraduate, is that when I came across an empirical article that I just thought was beautifully written, I couldn't tell you why it was beautiful or why the prose were really good, I would actually photocopy it and put it in a binder. And then I eventually came up with a collage. I still have it somewhere in my house. Collage of all these beautifully written introductions, what I found to be like perfect ones, and then result sections, discussion sections, method sections, and so on. And those are the ones that I use to model or to imitate for my own writing, not to plagiarize them, because obviously what I was studying was different, but to eventually get my writing up to that level. So exemplars from published articles, and I actually use all of this in my teaching of how to write with my students. And then books on writing. I am a fan of getting new books because I always feel like I need to reinvigorate my own writing. And so if I find a new book about writing, I will pick it up. And now there's some really true classics out there like Zinsser on Writing Well. It's really good. There's a new one that I would highly recommend for undergraduates and graduate students. But I found a lot that I could glean from it. It's called How to Write a Lot, which is just fantastic. And I actually have that in my resources slide. I'll show you. All right, so I'm going to use Psych 355. This is the main class I teach. I actually inherited this class from Bob Madigan when he retired 10 years ago. And it's the most writing-intensive course in the psychology curriculum. Students are required to write 12 APA-style lab reports based on data they collected in the lab, and also 3 APA-style papers as well. So it's a lot of writing. And I don't know the amount of pages that students probably generate, but it's over 100 pages probably throughout the semester. So the whole purpose, I just want to give you some background. The whole purpose of the class and the lab is to do experimental psychology, which is essentially the application of the scientific method to basic behavioral processes. So students design experiments, collect data, analyze the results just like any scientist would, and draw conclusions, and then write reports in APA style. Okay. Now I don't expect students, as soon as they come to the class, to write a full-on APA style report. I know that they've been exposed to it at various stages in their undergraduate career, if they've taken any of the English classes in the social sciences or our lower division research methods classes. So I teach it in small little steps. So they really don't have to produce a full-on APA-style report until the end of the semester. There's a huge emphasis on writing. In the lab, you would think that they're just there to learn techniques and apply statistical tests to analyze their data. But really, every lab lecture I have, I started out with the APA-style requirements. So some of those APA-style requirements are obviously going to be the boring formatting ones. But some of them actually are a little bit more in-depth on how students can learn to write. So Psych 355 emphasizes writing skill, which is, of course, an important college activity. And we just received from our alumni survey in the psychology department from students that have graduated in the last 10 years, 98.6% of them said that the writing skills that they learned were absolutely crucial for what they're doing after UAA. And a lot of our students aren't in graduate school, so it's not that they're publishing empirical reports, but they're out there applying their writing skills on a daily basis. It's fundamental. All right, so writing is also discipline specific. I mean, I can always, when I read an article, I can always tell if the person comes from my subfield or from an outside area. We all have our own little dialect, for sure. Or I can tell if it's a biologist that's studying a topic that is typically done in my field and just the other way around. We all have our own little dialect, and it's the hardest part to actually be able to teach. And to be honest with you, it's kind of magical to even talk about that dialect because it really comes with a lot of experience with reading journal articles. So writing discipline specific. And my goal, it's pretty aspirational. I want my students to write like a psychologist. And I mean, at the beginning of the semester, they don't sound like a psychologist at all. But my goal is by the end of the semester, when I read their papers, and even though it's the longest, densest paper, it's actually the most fun to grade because it reads like someone from my field wrote it. Okay, so it also reflects the way that psychology thinks about its subject matter. A lot of students think that APA style is just about formatting. It's really not. And there was an article that came out back in the mid-90s published by Bob Madigan and Patty Linton, who's faculty member and associate dean here at UAA. And the title of the article is The Language of Psychology, APA Style as Epistemology. So they talked about the writing conventions are, of course, important, the formatting and all of that, because it really is an outline of how we approach our subject matter. But fundamentally, it's really about values in the discipline. And you can only do that by writing through APA style. So as students learn to write in APA style, they also learn to think like a psychologist. And that's really the way that I look at APA style. It's more than just formatting a journal article and getting the italices right and so forth. It really is about thinking like a psychologist. All right, so particulars. Now I am picky about the formatting because I'm a scientist fundamentally, and I think that people need to pay attention to detail. So attention to detail helps master the writing conventions for sure. And like I mentioned, I don't expect students from day one to write a full-on APA-style report. So with each lab report, I ask them to focus on just small little pieces, small little components of APA style that we'll emphasize on that particular lab report. So like experiment 1, here's the requirement. You need to do a properly formatted title page and know how to display data in a figure. Okay? Now that sounds like it's just all surface structure stuff, but actually the title page and the figure are fundamental to a manuscript because that's the way psychologists, all reports have to have a cover page and they all have to have some kind of way of displaying data. Okay? And I'm not going to go through all the different experiments. Experiment 2, we emphasize results in displaying data in the table. Experiment 3, the big focus is on the method section. Okay. Experiment 6 is abstract, which even though it's a small part of the paper, it's actually a really important part of the paper. It's hard to write. And then experiment 10, we focus more on the introduction and the discussion. Okay. So they have to do 12 of these, and each one has its own little focus on APA style. All right, so APA style resources, the way that I teach it, of course, APA manual, and I saw them over here, the 6th edition. That, of course, is a major resource, but I actually put together my own APA style writing tips that are going to be important for succeeding in my class. So that's the main resource that my students have. I also have what I call exemplars, where I will take 3, let's say, method sections. And one is really well written. Another one is kind of lukewarm, and another one is absolutely terrible. And I have the students actually go through, after I give the general overview of that particular section or that piece of APA style, I actually have them go through and I said, I recommend you be an editor, put your editor's hat on, and I said, don't worry about egos here. And just give feedback to each of these writers and then rank order these specific articles, or these sections. And the students tend to build consensus, and we have a big discussion around it. And usually, the students in general, 90% of them will agree on which one's the best one. And I'll tell them to circle that one, and that's the one they should try to emulate when they're writing their own method sections. The other resource I use is I actually, in the lab manual, I give them specific journals that they should consult. And look and see how writers write about the topics in those particular journals. And those journals relate directly to the topics in Psych 355. We give a lot of feedback on reports. I tell students no matter how well they think they write or how well they've been told in the past how good of a writer they are, to check their ego at the door. Because really we're not there to destroy their ego, but we really do want their behavior to change, their writing behavior to change over the course of the semester, and they should be open to feedback. Okay, so we definitely give a lot of feedback, and luckily I have some really good TAs to help out with that. And then finally the APA manual. But typically the resources I require for my students are my actual custom-made lab manual that has these exemplars, and then the feedback on the reports, and then if there's any questions, APA manual itself. So some advice to students. So if I were to give advice to students on how best to write, again, this comes from a lot of my own experience, but also the empirical literature. Writing regularly is really important. It's absolutely important. This is something I've had to work on since I was an undergraduate myself, is really the binge writing sessions over the long haul are not productive. In fact, it's been shown that you become less creative as a result of binge writing sessions and so forth, and you're just overall less productive as far as overall output's concerned. And so I set aside, and right now I'm kind of in a lull because the book just came out and I'm kind of burned out on writing entirely. But in general, I write several times a week in small sessions. And that's something that you'll see across many disciplines, is writers will say that if I write just 1 or 2 hours a day, my overall output is really high. Some of the data show that people that they write on a regular basis, their follow-up experiments actually are a little bit more creative than what they would have thought of otherwise. So there's a lot of benefits to doing that. And I would say daily if possible. The famous psychologist B.F. Skinner, he wrote something like 200 peer-reviewed articles and 20 books over the course of his 62-year career. Pretty impressive output. And the way he was able to do it was by waking up at 5 a.m. And as soon as he woke up, he would write for 2 hours. And that was it. Just 2 hours a day of writing. He was able to do that amount of output. It's just incredible when you think about it. I've found that keeping track of productivity is actually really helpful for making goals. It makes writing fun because sometimes it's pretty mundane, especially if you're trying to go through a methods section in writing that. Sometimes it can be boring to write. But I make goals on how many words I want to write in that particular writing session. I also know on average how fast I write for a published article. And it turns out for every published word that I've had come out, it takes me about 15 seconds to produce that. So I'm about 4 words a minute on average, and that includes editing and so on. And so I try to make little goals, like I want to go to 4.1 on this manuscript, for example, and it makes it more exciting, and I have goals to reach. Read a lot of empirical articles. That's really the way to learn the culture of the discipline. So reading on a regular basis helps with that. And adopt the prose. Like I mentioned, when I was an undergraduate, I had this binder just full of what I found to be exemplar sections of APA articles, and I tried to match my writing to that same style and to make the writing sound like the exemplars. So those are my main 2 pieces of advice: writing regularly, which is hard. It's hard to do, but when you think about just 1 hour, 2 hours a day, or maybe 3 sessions a week, and maybe you only crank out 200 words per hour or session or something like that, over time it's actually going to yield a lot of output. And then some resources I pulled. These are all right next to my writing desk, so I can grab them. On Writing Well by William Zinsser. I read this about every 2 years when I'm looking for inspiration, and it's been around for about 35 or 40 years. How to Write a Lot's relatively new. This is about increasing productivity. This is ideal for undergraduates and graduate students. And then this one here by Robert Boyce, it's Professors as Writers, and it's basically how professors can apply a lot of the principles and write on a regular basis and be better writers. All right, well, that's all I have. Any questions?
Would you say you have 10,000 hours of writing underneath your belt?
I think so.
Would that make you a master?
I hope so. Yeah, I've got about 15 years of data on myself, so yeah. I'd have to add it up. I don't know if I've reached the 10,000 hour mark. What Mary's referring to is that in order to become an expert in any domain, typically it seems to be about 10,000 hours of deliberate practice. So that's what you're referring to, right?
Yes.
Yeah, I think I'm up there, but I don't know. But I always find that writing is a difficult activity, so I never feel good about it. I'm always trying to get better. Yeah, hi.
Would you be willing to share your APA style guide with the Writing Center?
Sure. Yeah, yeah, absolutely.
Because it helps us do our jobs better if we know what you want.
Yeah, and I'm sure students that are in my class come for advice. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah, so I have a couple of appendices that I could give you. Yeah, hey, Jack.
Oh, I was just going to say, I love that idea of collecting exemplars. I mean, it's a tradition that goes way back to the point of, commonplace books and even single sentences that stand out that are memorable. And I think just learning from that level of imitation makes a lot of sense. I think there's a lot of, people talk about originality and authenticity, but really imitation is the way you get there sometimes.
Yep.
And you discover your own voice by kind of participating.
Yep.
So I like that incremental approach as well. So I know that might even give the tutors questions to ask other students from other disciplines too about how often do you write, or what are some good samples that you've seen?
Yeah,
out there?
and I recommend to my students, I mean, really start writing these papers early on. And of course, you know how students are, right? I mean, I was a student myself. Really, sometimes it's just hard to, schedule everything. And so when I get a lot of like last minute, well, I shouldn't say, just questions in general, they're always the night before the papers due, which goes against the advice I give. Start thinking about it early, But sometimes it's not avoidable, yeah.
Could you give us maybe like little examples of the differences you were talking about, the different dialects in the fields of psychology between maybe your writing field and say like social psychology?
Sure. So in my field, and this is more on just general organization of the paper, you'll see a lot of subheadings organizing paragraphs. Whereas in social psych, I can't speak specifically to it, but let's say clinical psychology and the empirical literature there, you won't see a lot of subheadings trying to organize the various themes. And that's just one that comes to mind. Another difference is in the use of tables versus figures. In my field, figures tends to be the way you display your data. It's like art. But in like clinical psychology, for example, it really is, it's all tabular. So, I mean, that's just, these are just superficial examples, but I always know, okay, this is a clinical journal article, or this is somebody from my field, because there's all these figures all over the place. Another common one, and this is something that Bob Madigan and Patty Linton talked about, is hedging is really common in my field. So we really hedge a lot on our conclusions, always open it up for alternative explanations. It's not as definitive as other disciplines. Yeah, Chris.
As a follow-up to that, maybe it would be interesting to talk about the paper that we just wrote. Since we're co-authors with you and me and Gwen, and the differences in our writing during that process. So.
Yeah. I'm trying to think what would be the main. I didn't actually sit down and go, gosh, Chris writes a lot different than the rest of us.
Well, I guess I could step in and say that from my perspective, it may be that I found it more different than you did, because we were submitting to a psychology journal, and because you and Gwen were the lead, and then I was contributing my section. Just getting the draft manuscript and reading through it and thinking, God, this is the weirdest way that this data is presented, just because it's sort of like, experiment 1, blah, 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 blah. Experiment 2, blah, 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 which we don't write that way in biology. And also just sort of the way that the methods were split into two different components. There was the section which is, we bought this from here, we got this from there, we did this with that, and then later the experimental design, where we don't write that way at all. So
and that's specific to that journal, by the way.
and I figured a lot of that was journal specific, but it was still, I'm not aware of a journal in biology that approaches it that way, and so.
And you're right, and that journal, we got an press article in it. It's actually an interdisciplinary journal, but there's a huge experimental psychology flavor to it that it really does come out of the way that's experimental psychologists do, right? But we do have more where it's more integrative, where you just have the materials section, and then you describe your procedure section for all of your various experiments and so forth.
Because ours are usually way more integrated than that. Like within your experimental design, you've got references to materials and things that are parenthetical. So it's very different.
So that would definitely be another difference between the disciplines for sure. Other questions?
One other comment. One thing we like to have students do in the English department, especially in the science writing courses, is to examine that great genre, which is the instructions for authors or the notes to contributors. They're just they've got great information in there about exactly what that journal wants. And sometimes it's almost like an assignment sheet that they give you. Some of them are elaborate and extensive. I've been fascinated by that genre myself. And I think a lot of people don't know it's there.
I probably don't. You know, the one of the flagship journals in my field, every January issue has their what they are looking for, and then they have an addendum to that where all the variations from APA style that are acceptable, which I found always pretty interesting, because that's a cultural difference too. In subdisciplines, they're not, you know, following APA style to a T. Yeah.
Well, we should probably, go ahead and ask, and then we should transition. Yeah.
Are you planning, or have you thought about publishing about your own study of your writing? You said you've been doing this for a long time, and you
I have
very
a-
specific things about it. Is that? It sounds like it'd be very interesting to read.
It probably would be. Maybe I should have included some figures in this talk, but it would be something worth looking into for sure. I mean, there have been like these case studies published on authors and what their writing habits were. Like Jack London is one that comes to mind, and this is not one to emulate by any means, but Jack London is important for Alaska. But he was an incredibly productive author over his relatively short career, and the way that he was able to maintain his lifestyle. And many of you might know that he died pretty young. He died when he was 41, and he had a drinking problem. But he used this drinking problem as a motivator, and not in the way that I would recommend. In that, I mean, I get it. I understand. He followed perfect behavioral principles before behavioral principles were known, but he wouldn't allow himself to drink until after he had written his allotted, I think it was 1,000 words is what he needed to produce each day in order to get the book output that was required for him to maintain his place down in California and his boat and all the other crazy things that he was doing at the time. And so then what he would do is spend the rest of his day drinking. And then one time he thought, well, gosh, you know, he woke up one morning and he thought, well, I could probably get away with drinking this early and writing. And it turned out it took forever for him to write his 1,000 words. And so he decided he's only going to write sober. And so to use my language, or my field's language, he used alcohol as a reward or a reinforcer for all that productivity. But other people use other types of rewards that are less damaging to the body. Yeah.
Just real quick, is there like one common pervasive mistake that people make when writing APA that just like drives you crazy? Like if you had to pick one pet peeve that you see students making a lot.
I can't think of one. There's a lot of them. And some of them are trivial. They just come up repeatedly. Maybe just not getting the organization correct. What I like about APA style is that really you just need to fill in the blank. I mean, the organization's there, and when I think about a problem in my field, I automatically start with the introduction, the method. I can see the outline in my head, the results, even how the results should be described. Even when I teach results, it comes right out of an APA-style themed article with the organization. So I can't think of it. Oh, you know what? Here's something that bugs me. And this is more personal than it is APA style, but a lot of students, when they learn inferential statistics, so whether or not there are significant differences between their groups or their conditions, they get really excited about throwing these inferential statistics into the results section, but you can't interpret those results unless you first describe them, right? And then included your descriptive statistics and also referred the reader to a figure or a table. Only then will the inferential statistics make any sense? And so that would be one mistake I see on a regular basis, is they just whip out some F ratios and, you know, they're so excited. And, you know, but it's, as from the reader's perspective, it's impossible to interpret what that means.
Well, thank you, Eric.
Sure, my pleasure.
Appreciate it.
Okay, well, we should have gotten here first, because we knew that we were going to overlap completely with what Eric was going to say. And he's essentially scooped us all, scooped everything we're going to do. So I would recommend that we revisit his slides, and we just add our content to what he's already described.
Makes sense.
Because essentially, we're doing the same thing.
Yep.
So if we could bring his slides back
We're
up.
using you, Eric.
And we'll just take the topics for you.
Yeah.
So if we could do that, I think that would work.
Because I think it'd be interesting with a lot of these to also just point out some of the places where biology and psychology differ, as well as,
Right.
you know, where, but so much of it is definitely similar.
Yeah. But he's very, very much stolen our thunder.
Yeah.
Okay, so about us. Let's see. So first of all, I'm Don Spallinger. I'm in the Department of Biology, and this is Chris Duddleston, and we're both professors in biology. So in addition to our role as instructors, as teachers in biology, we have important components of our workload as research. So we're scientists. And much like Eric, our science is very closely aligned with his. We do the same experimental type work. As scientists, of course, you're all familiar with what science is. It's essentially the discovery of how the world around us works. What is it? Eric is interested in the discovery of how humans work, how the mind works, how animal behavior works. We are interested in biological processes, how the world works, from everything from how the universe began to how a single cell in your body becomes cancerous. The main thing about science is that the discovery is the beautiful part of it. Discovering how the world works is what drives us. At least, yeah, I think
Yeah.
it's fair
Okay.
to say
Yeah.
it drives us. And that interest and that curiosity is paramount in the work that we do. However, science is only half complete. In fact, it's only 10% complete with the discovery of something about nature. We have to essentially express that. We have to communicate that knowledge, that new knowledge, to our peers and to the rest of the world. And so writing essentially is the paramount way that we do that. So we have to write, and it's essentially the only permanent record, precise record of how we communicate that information and how our peers will judge that information, whether it's correct, whether it's incorrect, whether it's incomplete, and so forth. So writing is absolutely essential for what we do. And of course, we didn't grow up as writers. We grew up as scientists, and we had to learn the writing process. And for my experiences, it's been a piecemeal process. We learn by all the techniques that Eric has talked about here. So what types of writing do we do?
So yeah, the types of writing are certainly the same as what Eric has already presented. So journal articles in the peer-reviewed literature, where we're communicating our findings to the scientific community and beyond. And just to emphasize what Don said, if we don't do that, then the discovery is pointless. You know, if it never gets out there, then it might as well have never happened, and it dies with you. And then someone else comes along and does it again and reports it, and they get all the credit. So that's really an extremely important part of it. The literature and theoretical reviews are things that we would do, and then grant writing. And I think probably for us, if we had put this together, we probably would have slid the grant writing up above the literature and theoretical reviews, only because that is such a significant part of our job. Writing proposals, because you have to be able to sell your ideas to the funding agency in order to be able to do the work. So we have those same genres of writing, and I would add also that with respect to the journal articles as well as the grant writing, one of the important things about learning to write is in our discipline is that those two types of writing, there's a lot of similarity between the two of them, but there are also significant differences between the two of them because of the audience that you're trying to reach. But in both cases, and we were having a long discussion about this yesterday, both of them are narratives, but in one, the peer review journal, it's knowing your audience and understanding what's the most important finding about the work that you did, and then presenting that in such a way that the audience is going to find it equally as compelling as you do, and that it's going to contribute something significant to the field. And then the grant writing is similar, except you have to write to an audience to convince them that you have an innovative question, that you have the appropriate experimental design that will actually allow you to answer that question and generate meaningful results, and that those results, will advance the field, and therefore they need to give you that money. So you're selling your ideas, and you have to also be able to recognize the funding source, what their mission is, and you need to be able to write to that audience. You're going to write a proposal to NIH very differently than you do to the National Science Foundation because of the audience and the kind of research that they support, even if you might be you're just spinning the exact same project. Anyway, I guess that's what I would add to there. And I think it's true in your discipline as well. I think we're just kind of adding some extra info,
Right.
So.
So in terms of experience with writing, of course, I think we're in the same boat the same explanation that Eric gave you. Better writing comes with experience, with doing it. You got to do it over and over again. You got to repeat it. And this is one thing that we try to, I've emphasized this in my classes with my undergraduate students and even my graduate students. It's like, you've got to do it. If you want to become an expert basketball player, you got to play lots of basketball. If you want to be an expert skier, you got to ski a lot. And I try to convince my students that if you want to be a good scientist, you got to do lots of science. And if you want to be a good writer, if you want to be successful as a scientist, first and foremost, you've got to be a good writer. Because the interesting thing is, if you're a scientist, nobody pays you to do what you want to do. You've got to convince somebody that you're worthy of doing that kind of science. So you've got to convince your peers, in particular, your peers, because our peers are the ones that evaluate our scientific proposals to NSF, to NIH, and so forth. So we've got to convince our peers that we know what we're doing and we can do it in a professional manner. We can get the job done and we can publish those results. So actually writing grants is a very complicated process of being successful at writing beforehand, having a nice publication record, and being successful at convincing your peers that you've got a good idea and that you know how you're going to answer that question or solve that problem. And that's a critical issue just to get started for us. If we can't get the funding to do research, and particularly in this day and age where the expense of doing scientific research in our field or in chemistry or in physics is huge. I mean, we have budgets that often exceed $1 million a year for a research project. And to convince the federal government right now, NSF and so forth, that you're worth $1 million a year takes some pretty sophisticated writing. You've got to be good. Mm-hmm. And it's the writing that gets you there. So experience with writing, we do it all the time. We do it over and over again, and that's the only way we get better. I think Eric pointed out these things, and that's exactly what we were going to say. I mean, at every one of these points, exactly what we talk about. Deliberate practice, feedback from mentors. We both had feedback from mentors. We both give our graduate students tremendous amounts of feedback. I don't think I've ever had a graduate student whose paper didn't come back more read on it than their own original writing. And we spend a tremendous amount of time going through each of their theses. 4 or 5 times is not even unreasonable. No. Exemplars from published articles. I think this is a really good point. I do the same with my students, and I point out, this is a beautiful article. You got to read this. And even though it's not on the same track as what you're doing, look at how this is written. Look at the way they put together their story. Look at the way it's organized. Look at the way it's presented to your audience, and and try to find these kinds of papers to enhance your own writing.
I think another thing that I would add to that, and this would be some of my own personal experience as I was becoming a better writer, definitely a lot of the deliberate practice, and some of that came as my own the writing that was required of me as a student, and then when I got into graduate school, the same thing but at a slightly higher level, receiving feedback from teachers and mentors, reading a lot of papers. And I think, and that even goes back to when you're very young, I think we all know that the more you read from the beginning, the better a writer you are. And so when you're trying to shift into some kind of a discipline-specific writing, then reading in that discipline a lot becomes a really important part of learning to write in that discipline. But I also think one of the things that helped me a tremendous amount was journal clubs, especially student-driven journal clubs, because by having that kind of fixed process, it forced you to read the journal articles a lot, and not even just in your subdiscipline, but say, for me, biology in general. Because then you really learned a lot about the different ways that ideas are presented, the different ways results are presented and discussed. So, you know, that was the kind of thing I think for me personally was participating in journal clubs, and that was the reading side of things that was really important to the writing. And then I would say that my largest improvements in writing came with having to write proposals in graduate school, having to write a master's thesis, having to write my dissertation, and just the constant back and forth feedback from mentors along the way. But
I tell my graduate students the feedback from mentors is really good, but feedback from your colleagues, not necessarily your mentors, but your colleagues as well. And that might work. We do this occasionally in our classes. We have our students peer review themselves. I'm not convinced that works very well, because when I have done that, they all agree that their writing is fine, you know. And it's just not the case. And whether that's because they're afraid to critique each other, you know, honestly, I think that's part of it. But the other thing is they don't have the experience and the skill set to critique it to begin with, you know, or to understand what good writing is versus what bad writing is. On the undergraduate level. In the graduate level, it's a little better, because they're starting to learn from us what they're doing wrong. And we have the time to interact with them, feedback one-on-one to do that. But even my writing, when I write an article, when I write a manuscript for publication, I've got several people that I can, you know, characteristically send it to, because I know they're going to rip it apart. You know, and if I send a manuscript to somebody and it comes back and they say, oh, it's fine, it looks good, I know I got to, you know, that didn't do me any good at all. So I send it to my friends that have no qualms about ripping my head off and telling me what's wrong with it, and it makes a much better article. So those are a couple of things that I think that I convince my students that they need to find those people that will always give them an honest review and not worry about hurting your feelings.
Yeah.
Leave your ego at the door. Yep.
I think I would add to that too is that just my own improvement in writing, even over the last few years, that writing collaboratively makes a big difference. And so I think it's important for students to recognize the benefit of writing collaboratively. And I can give examples working on grant proposals with co-PIs. I can remember a little over a year ago working on a proposal where there was a particular idea that we really needed to get across in this proposal. We were having a difficult time getting the wording right. And I just remember I was sitting in my kitchen, and it was probably 9 o'clock on a Saturday morning, and my collaborator was in his kitchen or living room or wherever he was doing the same thing, and we were emailing back and forth different versions of the same sentence. How about this? No, that doesn't get it. How about this? No, that doesn't quite say it. Until we finally I think I was the one that got it, actually. You know, it came to me, and I was like, oh, here it is. Yes, that's it. And that was the last thing we needed to do for this proposal. But that one sentence was an extremely important sentence to bring the whole thing together. And the fact that we were firing versions of the sentence back and forth is what resulted in finding it. You know, so I think that's, you know, that goes to what you were saying, is getting feedback from your peers in that process. So.
Oh, the books on writing. I'd add Williams to that list. That's my favorite book, and I read it about every 2 years. I go, oh yeah, I forgot about that. Yeah. And actually, you know, Williams spends a lot of time talking about the benefits of using instead of using passive voice, using active writing. And my undergraduate students, and even our graduate students, can characteristically use passive writing in everything they do. And I try to get them to flip that around and at least use active writing more than they use passive writing in their papers. And it's amazing how reluctant they are, or how reluctant they are to learn that process, you know, to take those sentences and rewrite them in that form. And they say, well, it's just fine the way it is. They're convinced that it's just perfect writing, even though I think that the active form, particularly for science, is a very good way to do that. And they just don't get it, and I can't convince them to do it.
Well, and I think part of the problem is that I've had conversations with students about it, is that there are people that ingrain in them they have to do past tense active if it's, past tense third person, you know, passive voice if it's scientific writing. You know, there's this old style that's how scientific writing is done, and we're trying to move them away from that, but they still get it, and I think they still get it in chemistry and things like that. And so I think it becomes confusing for our students because they're being given in their different undergraduate courses sometimes conflicting information about how things should be written. And I think that makes it really difficult for them to pull a lot of this together. So.
Should we skip to advice to students? We have the same kinds of style manuals for science. It's pretty much the same. I think the only thing I'd add to Eric's talk is that style and particularly the specific styles that journals use are quite diverse.
In biology,
and particularly the format of your papers. And ecologists use one format, cell biologists use another. So biology is a diverse field, and there's a diversity of different formats for publications.
Yeah, we don't have the equivalent of an APA style manual.
We've got several of them.
Yeah, we have several of them. There's not one that does it. So that can make it difficult for our students too, because when I require writing in my classes, I'm basing my requirements on my subdiscipline in biology, but then they go to Don's and it's going to be different. And
slightly different.
Yeah, slightly, not completely, but slightly. So that can be problematic, you know.
So in terms of, you know, contrasting scientific writing versus other types of writing and creative writing and so forth, there really isn't much difference. And I think that's one of the things that I try to emphasize to my students is that scientific writing should emulate creative writing. There should be a story there. And if there's not a story, if it doesn't have this cohesion throughout the paper, if there's not a topic and a flow to that paper, a flow of ideas that is coherent, then you don't have a good scientific paper, and you're not communicating with your audience. So the thing that most students don't get is that they've got to look outside themselves. They've got to put themselves in their audience's shoes. Does the audience, first of all, what audience are they targeting? If it's a scientific peer-reviewed paper, the audience is obviously, in our case, a biologist that's in the same subfield of biology, an ecologist or a cell biologist or a microbiologist and so forth. And the terminology that we use in those subfields is quite distinct from each one of them, just as biology and psychology are quite distinct from each other. So they have to know the terminology. They have to be embedded in the knowledge of that subject matter, and be able to use the words and the vocabulary that subject requires. But it also has to, but the student also has to make sure that they communicate in a very concise way, and a very precise, concise or precise, and well, concise way and a very precise way. And that's probably the most difficult thing to do. The best scientific journals have papers that may be 2 to 3 pages long, period, including tables and literature cited. These are high-impact journals like Science and Nature and Cell, and you've got 2 pages to describe in detail 4 years of your life. You know, or 4 years of a group of scientists' lives that may be 20 people. And how do you do that? You've got to be very precise, and you've got to be extremely concise. And that is very difficult for most of us to do. What was it, Mark Twain, that says, "I've written you a long letter. I would have written you a short letter, but I didn't have time."
Yeah.
You know, it explains it perfectly, you know. You've got to spend the time in order to make it precise. It's like that sentence that you wrote.
Yeah.
You spend an hour writing one sentence to make it say exactly what you want it to say. And
now that sentence appears over and over again.
Yeah.
It's like, we know how to say this, so
Reusable.
every time it's a completely reusable sentence. So it's
Yep.
great.
Anyway,
It's in the list of reusable sentences.
so those are the main points that I wanted to get across.
Yeah.
How about any, move on?
Actually, maybe go back. Go ahead and go back to the. Oh, all right. Is there a back button?
Yeah,
Which one's?
I think.
Okay. You know, I'll go ahead and just talk about this, because we do take that approach in some of our classes as well, where we try to focus on different pieces of a biological report. And we'll do things like take a particular section, have students write that section, and then go back and talk about, you know, what good versions of it, not so great versions of it, and provide opportunities to rewrite sections. I don't know if you do rewrites, but so we take the same approach, and I think it's very helpful to take that approach. One of the things I wanted to use this particular slide to talk about, and this is actually going forward to the advice, is that, and this again is something that comes with practice, and that is recognizing that just because a paper in the biological sciences is written in a particular order, abstract, intro, materials and methods, results, discussion, doesn't mean that that's the order that you write those sections. Right? You know, and so you may actually you will get all your results together. Sometimes you might write the methods first, because the methods can be the easiest ones to at least outline, because you did it, so you know what you did. But then you put your results together and you start looking through them and figuring out, whoa, what do I have here? What story are my results telling me? And then you start figuring out what you're going to present, how you're going to put the data together, what you're going to say about it. You have all this data, not all of it's going to go in your paper. And so that's the other thing. Not everything, not every piece of data you generate in a project actually goes in a paper. And that's not because you're trying to pull wool over anybody's eyes. It's just that, you know, you have a certain number of pages to tell your story, and so you need to include the data that are the most supportive of what you found. And so not everything goes in, so then you figure out what goes in, and you write that up, and then you start thinking about what that means. And so then a discussion may come next before an intro, because and the reason this might be the case, and Don and I talked about this yesterday, is sometimes you set out to do work because you have a particular hypothesis that you're trying to test, objective, and it's based on the previous literature. You set out, you do the experiments, and the results are not what you expected, but they also tell a completely unexpected story. It's like, wow, we were not seeking to address this at all, but this is what we found. And so to give an example, Recently, we were interested in looking at how gut microbial communities change over the course of the first active season of an Arctic hibernator. From the time they were born until their first hibernation season, we were interested in whether or not they develop a gut microbial community that supports excessive fattening, because they get really fat before they hibernate. Well, we didn't really find that, but what we did find was that there was what we refer to as a litter effect, meaning that animals that were more closely related to one another, that were siblings or litter mates, had much more similar gut communities across the entire season than they did with non-litter mates who were at the same physiological state. So the point is, we ended up with these results that had nothing to do with the original question. So that means that the paper we wrote had nothing to do with the original question. The paper we wrote was telling the story of what we actually found. And so the results are written first and the discussion is written next. And then we go to the introduction and we say, okay, we need to craft this introduction that starts us here, narrows us down to here, so that the reader says, oh, well, the logical next question is this. And lo and behold, that's what they did. And then you move on. So I think that's one of these things. These different sections are all very important, but I think what you learn through practice is that you don't have to write a paper in the order that the information will be given. That sometimes it's the data that drives the order in which you approach that process, you know. So, yeah.
I mean, I kind of feel like I've noticed that even in just like completely non-empirical papers, like, you know, for whatever, you're just a really basic paper, like whatever you're talking about, I tend not to write the introduction first and just sort of jump into the body.
Yeah.
And then kind of do the conclusion. And then after that, usually the paper's already looking a little bit different than what I was expecting.
Exactly, yes.
So yeah, it's easier kind of then to go back and see the whole structure.
Yep.
Build the introduction around it.
And then the intro ends up being pretty easy to write.
Yeah,
Yeah.
a lot of cases.
So.
And it gets back to that story. You know,
Yeah, and
you've
it's
gotta-
always about a story, and I think
you know,
that's the
I think
the
that's
thing.
that's
You're
one
telling
thing
a
that
story.
students in science have a tough time understanding, is that we've got to tell a story too. You can't
Yeah.
just blurt out a bunch of garbage. You know, you can't just spew out a bunch of data, say, well, this is this and this is this, and okay, I'm done. It's got to tell a story in order to. You've got to capture your reader, whether it's a scientist or whether it's a layperson in the community. You've got to capture their imagination and capture their interest as well. So scientists, and in fact, the other interesting part of this whole process is the peer review process, right? We have to get these papers published somehow, which means we've got to convince our peers again to accept this work and get it published. Well, it's a social business, just like many other businesses in the world. And people are people. Scientists are not immune to all of the problems that other people have. And so it depends on, you know, the reviewers that you get, their personalities, how they feel that day that they picked up your paper and read it. But in most cases, I mean, there's kind of some of these empirical laws that we have, that the longer your paper is, getting back to Mark Twain's idea, the longer your paper is, the more likely it is to be rejected. And the messier it is, the more likely it is to be rejected.
No matter how great your paper is.
And if you have bad grammar in it, it's very likely to be rejected.
Yeah.
And regardless of what the content is. You know, so these are all important aspects of scientific writing, is putting it together concisely, making the story flow, having good grammar, because that immediately tips somebody off that you're an idiot, you know, versus you know how to write, you know, type of thing. So it is a social game, and we've got to understand human behavior here as well as anybody in order to get a publication out of it. And it is part of our life. I mean, it really is a publish and perish world.
Yeah, we don't get tenure if we don't do
If
it.
if we don't get these publications, then we're toast. So writing is extremely important to us.
I wanted to give all of you guys a chance to say something, but I like what you had to say, Chris, about, you know, these sort of journal clubs, reading and writing together, and that whole collaborative, interactive approach. I mean, we take a very social approach to trying to learn all this stuff, because writing is inherently social when you think about it. But I want to give you guys all a chance to say something about our undergraduate research program here at UAA, because I think that it's hard to think of yourself as leaping to that peer-reviewed journal stage when you're an
Yeah.
undergrad, and yet we have these things, and I know that Eric's a leader over at undergraduate research, but I expect all of your students to participate
Yeah.
at some level, and I think tutors in here could even maybe recommend to students to think about taking their writing to that other audience,
Yeah.
sharing what they've learned.
Yeah, well, we certainly, I think in both psychology and biology, we have active undergrad research programs. I'm PI of a summer research program, the REU program, and then and Dawn mentors students in that program, as well as undergrads outside that program all the time. And and what you just said about seeing yourself as an undergrad taking the leap to that point of being able to publish, do science that is of a publishable level and then getting it published. I think there are so many reasons why undergraduate research is a really important part of making that step. Because in an undergraduate research setting, you are engaging in an independent but mentored project. And we try to emulate that, or I shouldn't say emulate, I should say simulate that in classroom laboratory settings, but it's still not the same thing as doing an undergraduate research project. And so I think as a consequence of that, a student in undergrad research feels a lot more ownership and excitement over the data that they're generating. And so then the writing process, I think, is more exciting for them, and there's a greater investment in it. So I think that helps. The other thing I think is really important is for an undergraduate to come into a laboratory that has multiple levels of student in it, and by which I mean master's students, PhD students, and postdocs, as well as the faculty PI. Because I think it's really easy when you're an undergrad. You see professor, and it's a huge difference. But then if you're in a lab that has master's student, PhD student, postdoc, professor, then what you see is the different level of expectation for each step, and you recognize that each step is indeed attainable from the one previous to it. So an undergrad can see what's expected of a master's student and say, this is attainable for me, I can do this. And then your master's student, you see a PhD student, this is definitely attainable for me. And so you recognize that it's not one big giant leap, it's a stepward, gain. And that's in the writing and the doing of the science and being a member of a lab. So I think that's I think that undergrads who have those kind of undergrad research experiences, no matter what the lab, they're valuable. But I think that when you're participating in a lab that has these different levels of student and see different levels of expectation, that is really important.
Right. Our undergraduate research experiences usually involve the student in 1 year and possibly 2 years, rarely 3, but 2. And rarely have we gotten publications, first authored publications from our undergraduate students in a peer-reviewed journal. And the reason for that is that in that 1 year period, they're gaining that knowledge of the field. They're doing experiments. A lot of these experiments take a lot of time to master, and so they don't collect enough data to actually produce a peer-reviewed journal article in a science journal. In many cases, we do have a few exceptions to that.
But they might contribute to a co-author situation.
But they do.
Yeah,
They
absolutely.
contribute to the co-author, and so we have a lot of co-authored papers with our undergraduate students in them. So they contribute to larger projects, and most projects are multi-year projects. Even a master's student sometimes cannot generate enough good data to produce in 2 years to produce a viable scientific paper. It's a rigorous process nowadays. It takes a lot of work. But they do get that experience, and like Chris says, they build that experience, they build the vocabulary that they need, they build that writing experience, and they are part of a team that actually gets those publications. So that's you know, kind of the pitfalls of undergraduate research is they rarely achieve that level of capacity to produce a peer-reviewed science paper
On their,
at-
yeah, as an
at-
individual.
on their own.
Yeah.
But they see the path, yeah, and they usually go on for masters. A lot of our students go into medicine, which they just scribble things on prescription paper. Anyway,
So related to that, so what Chris was talking about is students gain a lot of skills by virtue of just doing undergraduate research and scholarship. And I think it's an important thing to point out that students that are doing undergraduate research are acquiring skills that normally wouldn't be available.
Yeah.
That they wouldn't normally
Definitely.
get just
Yeah.
through the standard college experience. And those skills are marketable for graduate school, like Don and Chris just mentioned, but also it turns out
Definitely.
that even if a student decides they don't want to go into graduate school, for whatever reason, it turns out the undergraduate research and scholarship experience, you know, above and beyond what you normally get, is actually really valued in the private sector as well. There's a lot of data coming out showing that students that have this undergraduate research experience, you know, as undergraduates, are deemed to be a better prospect for jobs in private industry. So those skills do translate to many different
Yeah.
contexts, not just science.
oh yeah.
If I can tack on to that, my background and my degrees are all in ecology and biology, and because of my undergraduate research, I fell in love with writing and the writing process and working with others through that, and that's why now I run the writing center. So my background isn't from the English department per se, but I came in from a different angle
Yeah.
and sort of abandoned what is still an interest, but kind of am working at the other angle
Yeah.
with writing. I had a question which was, which piece of writing are each of you most proud of that you've produced? It doesn't have to necessarily be from your field, but which piece are you most proud of, or did you enjoy the most, I guess?
Mine was a theoretical paper in American Naturalist, and it was most enjoyable to me because it was original thought about a process that had never been discovered, you know. So it was the discovery process, and that made the writing a lot easier because it was something that really thrilled me, and it was an important paper in my career.
Yeah.
But
I guess I would have to say that it was a proposal that I wrote a couple of years ago that did get funded, and maybe that's part of the reason why. But I think, you know, I think it also has to do with where I was in my own career, because when I first became a faculty member, I was in a teaching-only position, a 4-1 teaching-only position with no research requirement at all. And I made a decision to change that and move into a tripartite workload and start incorporating research back into my workload, which was not an easy thing to do at that point because I'd been teaching only for 7 years, which meant I didn't have a good publication record to sell myself to a funding agency. And I didn't have the momentum of a postdoc behind me. I didn't have any kind of startup whatsoever. So I had to do it all absolutely from scratch. And so that writing was a collaborative process with a colleague, a collaborator, to the NIH, and got it funded. But I think the whole process of putting that proposal together was a tremendous amount of fun. You know, I mean, it was a lot of hard work. I was living in Girdwood at the time, so I spent a couple of nights on my office floor here, so that I didn't have to do the drive back and forth and things like that. And so it was a lot of work, but it was also a lot of fun because just the ideas were flowing and everything was flowing, and you know, you end up with this product that you really like. You know, there was another experience where I loved the product, but the process was not a lot of fun because one of the collaborators was a nightmare to work with. And so, you know, sometimes you can have this experience that where some aspects of it in terms of the creative part of writing is there, but you're dealing with a nightmare of a potential colleague that kills it. And I'm almost glad that didn't get funded, because if it had, then we'd be dealing with her on a, you know, it probably would have just been a nightmare from beginning to end to do the work, you know, so anyway. So I gave you both sides of it, you know. But, yeah.
Mine was actually more like Don's. It was a kind of a theoretical / translational article. And it ultimately, it was my first UAA affiliated publication, actually. And I don't know if that's probably the reason why it's so important in my career, but also it turns out that I followed all of the rules I just told you. I wrote for 2 hours a day. I recorded all of the words that I generated. I wrote down my creative thoughts and did everything. I wrote it just like you know, I mean, and a lot of writing, unfortunately, doesn't follow that perfectly.
Yeah.
And so I got it published in a top-tier journal in my field, and it actually, in retrospect, it's my most cited article. And I didn't think much of it at the time. I was like, oh, I got to get this out. I'm a young faculty member. I got a class I need to prep, and I need to get my research started and all that. And it got accepted, and it just, in retrospect, it turned out to be a really important piece. But yeah, anyway, that was fun.
Yeah. I liked when we were writing this paper together because you said, okay, well in this journal, the introduction averages this many words in length in this journal. And the discussion averages this many words in length. So we need to have our intro be approximately these many words. And it's like, wow, that is just such a different way of looking at this. I've never approached it that way. It's great.
It's complete self-management. So when you think about it, like Don mentioned this, that really, I mean, you don't want to throw out there this big, long article.
Yep.
You want to really just say what you need.
Yeah.
And so I have actually gone through a lot of the major journals in my field and have actually calculated, even I've came up with my own statistic called the introduction discussion ratio. So I do it for planning purposes because I know I write 4 words per minute, right? And so if I want to get this, at least the first draft, and oh, by the way, and I don't know about if this is true with both of you,
analyst,
but my first drafts are just as awful as they ever have been. Back when I was in Jackie's class, actually, they were just as bad as they were back then.
Yeah.
Now the second drafts are much better.
Yes.
And the third drafts, it doesn't take as many drafts to get it up to speed, but the first draft is always just, it's embarrassing.
It
In
is.
fact, I don't even
You'd
let
never
people
want to
read.
send those out.
Yeah.
Yeah.
All the ideas are there, right?
Yeah.
There's an article by that name that I share with students.
Oh, okay, yeah.
We all write them.
Yeah, exactly.
I have to write them.
But anyway,
Just don't stop there.
Yeah.
yeah, and keeping those kinds of statistics I found are just useful for planning purposes.
Sure, yeah.
And then knowing what's acceptable for that particular journal.
Absolutely.
And in general, I have found I've had very few problems with ultimately getting, when I've used those statistics to kind of drive the writing process, I've had very few problems with getting stuff published.
And then you don't get that comment back from the reviewer that says, this paper is too long.
Right.
You can cut this out of the discussion or cut that out of the intro or something like that, which happens for sure. And the thing you said about the shitty first draft, and that makes me think about advice to students. And also this idea of start working on it in advance, don't do it at the last minute, is that I think often what I think there's this tendency to feel like you should be able to, the first time you sit down, just write out what is basically a great paper.
Perfect paper.
And a perception that that's what we do. But that's not even remotely close to what we do. And so to expect many, 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 many drafts of anything before it's in an acceptable form. And the final version may be vastly different from what you started with. It usually will be vastly different from what you started with. I had a friend who used to keep and print every draft of everything she wrote, and then when she would teach writing in a class, she would bring the stack in and say, here's the final paper, published form of the paper, and here are all the drafts of it. And let's look at the drafts and how many and how this changed from beginning to end. Just to emphasize to the students that even when you get to that point where you've mastered the writing process, you're not sitting down in one night and generating a publishable piece of work. It doesn't happen. So.
I've had, just to go with the behavioral approach, I think it's interesting to have students take the first draft, last draft, apply Microsoft Compare.
Oh, yeah.
And it will display for you through track changes the exact changes you've made, and if they're minor, then I guess you could see my
Probably
comments on the
that.
first one.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah.
I mean, it just makes it visual.
Yeah, that's
for
a
you.
great idea, yeah.
Yeah, I often tell my students, my graduate students to, don't worry about getting it perfect, just write.
Yeah.
Write your ideas down.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, they don't go through it a couple of times on their own. They just hand me the first draft.
Yeah.
And I
Yeah.
go, no,
Yeah.
this is
Uh-uh.
bad.
Yeah.
They go,
Don't
well,
do
you
that.
said to write everything,
Yeah.
all my ideas down.
Yes.
But filter it.
Yeah.
And revise it a couple of
Let
times.
it sit a
you
couple
know.
days.
Yeah. And go back. Okay,
We're running out of time.
yeah.
At any rate,
Wow, thank you very much.
yeah,
Thanks
thank you
for your
guys so
slides,
much.
Eric.
Yeah.
Appreciate it.